I'm sure you found that, as did I, to be a most interesting and stimulating speech from a true expert, a person as the President of the Commission having personal responsibility for these areas. I also know that Professor Triggs is very willing indeed to receive questions from you, particularly because you are within that group of people representing the community with whom the Commission wants to interact. So we've got some time for questions. I think having regard to the time, perhaps only 10 minutes, but I do invite now questions from the floor. Yes, Paula.
I was delighted to...
Paula, could you say who you are?
Paula Gerber from the Casson Centre for Human Rights Law at Monash University. I was delighted to hear your emphasis on education as a way of creating a human rights culture. And I saw recently that the Commission released a new guide about how to use the national curriculum for human rights education. But of course we now have a curriculum review being undertaken by Donnelly and Wiltshire, and I was wondering what your view is of that and what position the Commission is taking on that.
Well, thank you, Paula. Paula's been a colleague and friend of mine for a very long time, so it's lovely to see you here. This is an awkward question, because we've been working for a very long time with the Australian curriculum body to integrate human rights law into the curriculum. In other words, rather than having geography, maths, science, biology, and an option here over here in human rights, we want to be sure that there's a human rights and ethical approach across all of the subjects. And I've learned that you can in fact teach maths but with reference to ethics and data collection in a way that meets human rights standards. So we and the staff have been working very hard to achieve those curriculum changes. But we have to be, and this is why your question is so interesting and difficult to answer, in the sense that if we really put a huge effort into publicising our curriculum, we play straight into the hands of those in the political arena who would see us as placing an emphasis on quite politically correct issues like Indigenous matters, pregnancy laws and employment, freedom of speech, that we would be distorting the curriculum in a way which is unacceptable. So what we're trying to do now is to wait and see how this review emerges. We've made our submissions and we'll see what happens. But I suppose the short answer to your question is there's a limit to how much public attention we can attract, and so we'll bide our time. But another interesting and important example is we have a discussion paper on the rights to freedom of religion, which we will release shortly. But that too will be controversial. So I have to balance as a president, when is being controversial valuable to achieve an outcome, and when is it actually destructive and fails to achieve that outcome? And getting that balance right is difficult too. But thanks, Paula.
Yes.
Dr. Bahan Ahmed, chairperson of the African think tank. I've got two questions. One, an area that you highlighted, and I feel like within Australian society we've got, as you mentioned, about 30,000 asylum seekers. This is the hidden issue that we're living with as a community. In the last 3 months we've had 2 suicides committed because they get an Oxford written letters which they hardly understand. Let them know that myself I can understand. And the simple answer for that reading is someone has to read for them, and it's either yes or no, in a simple way. And they've got no way to go. And you know, we talk about so much human rights, and people are just crying and dying. And you know, I consider what's happening, you know, out of Australia's jurisdiction, as in the Manus Island. But we've got people here suffering, and no one is listening. They don't have enough money to live. They don't have right to work. So where is that basic human right that we're talking? The second question, as a Muslim, and this has been for some time now, and I feel like within my community, there's one night, any night could come terrorism and attack and I don't have any power to defend myself or to stand against helicopters and tanks and whatever coming around the houses. So, you know, in a country with such civilized and such systems, that why do we need to harass mothers sleeping, little kids, in a, you know, especially as a Muslim, I feel it, because anytime anything can happen, anything, you know, and particularly I've had it in the last 4 or 5 years, targeting members of our community. So faceless ASIOs, interrogating individuals, and at times coming at night and you know, giving hassles to people. So what I want to
those
do
two
is,
questions.
thank you. What I want to is to highlight with the basics of human rights. Where do we stand? Where do people stand? Thank you.
Professor Triggs.
Well, with regard to your first question, I think as I was trying to, and you clearly have appreciated the problem, that we have a lot of media attention on Manus and Nauru, and they are in parlous circumstances. But what we haven't yet faced up to as a community is that we have tens of thousands of people on bridging visas with no work rights, who are living despairing lives, and where I fear we're going to have, and I speak to a lot of these people, typically young men, enthusiastic, bright-eyed young men who want what my son wanted, an education and an opportunity to go on with their lives, but they're not. They're stuck in this position. Without wanting to be quoted, I can see them hanging around a shopping centre, committing a minor offence, maybe making remarks they shouldn't, getting in the way. I can see them being criminalised gradually and increasingly angry. And then we're going to have Australians saying, well, these people are, you know, distorting the Australian life and not accepting the values that we have. Now, the reality is that by leaving these people in limbo as we have, we're actually creating a problem that as a society we really haven't yet come to terms with. So I totally support the thrust of your first question. And clearly, of course, they have human rights, but the difficulty is how we actually implement them when bridging visas and no work rights at the moment is the position. The government's trying to get temporary protection visas. And frankly, people are going to be better off with a temporary protection visa because at least they can work. But that's a point of view. That's simply a point of view. Others say, well, no, you've got to have a full right or no right. The trouble is that by saying no right at all, you're leaving them empty with no opportunities. And as an educationalist, and Paula will respond to this, I'm deeply offended by the idea that they have to pay such high sums for their education. Because these young men want training, they want to work. And to charge them the fees that we do in order to have access to that education is quite unacceptable and, in my view, contrary to human rights. Now, your second point, the fear in the Muslim community, I must say I'm very distressed to hear that you report that. I can only say that we have to work with our police, with our community groups, to make sure that that fear is not realised. And my belief is that our community groups and police in particular are increasingly conscious of perceptions and determined to ensure that we live in a safe environment. So I can only say that I hope that fear proves not to be realised and that you have the support of community groups to make sure that doesn't happen.
Thank you very much. I think we've probably reached the end of the line. We don't have any time for more. Yes, was there somebody waiting? Is there? The last question, thank you. Yes, yes, Professor Triggs.
Pamela Kerr from the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre. Gillian, why does the High Court find it so difficult to observe, to make rulings around the arbitrary, indefinite detention of people? I know that they say under our constitution you can detain for administrative purposes. Anybody with a brain can see that what is happening in our detention centres in no way fulfils that criteria of administrative detention. Why are they grappling so hard with the idea that it is wrong to arbitrarily and indefinitely detain human beings? I don't understand. The cases go up, they fall down.
Fall over. That's right. Thank you for your question, and I know it's one that everybody, asks me. We have a vigorous, highly qualified High Court and federal judges in the federal court. the difficulty is the one that I was alluding to earlier when I was talking about the nature of international law and domestic law. The problem is that if you have a clear piece of legislation passed by Parliament, and that legislation permits you to act in this way, the High Court will interpret that legislation consistently with the words of that legislation. Now, some judges, and I must mention Michael Kirby here, but some judges will say, well, just hang on a minute, just wait. We have the common law, we have the Magna Carta, we have a cultural view that you do not arbitrarily detain, we have the United Nations Human Rights Committee, which has condemned Australia for arbitrary detention and says that the nature of our detention is cruel, inhuman, and what's the word? Degrading treatment. Thank you, Paul. We have the UN making that finding. But the trouble is that that's not part of Australian law. Statutes, to put it very, very overly simply, statutes trump those other provisions. And that is why we had the Alcatel decision by the High Court of Australia, a shameful decision in my view, in which we allowed the possibility and practical fact of somebody who had been adjudged to be a refugee, who was stateless, and the government decided to hold him permanently. Now, I thank goodness Australians do get there to the right answer in the end, because he was ultimately released. He's now an Australian and he's happily living in the society. So I do believe, I'm an Australian, I do believe we get to the right answer in the end, but this is a painful, difficult process. I think we'll get to the right answer on those that are being detained at the moment, and frankly, children are being moved out, people are being moved out of mandatory detention in quite good numbers at the moment. We've still got, from the department, they told me yesterday, about 5,000. They say they're working on it. Well, I say working on it's not good enough. I want you to move a little faster, but I think I can say that we are moving in the right directions. We're never going to solve the problem of the ASIO security assessment ones. Even if they are refugees, we're not going to solve that one. The government will hold them as long as possible. We say they should be out in at least community detention, give them curfews, give them ankle bracelets or whatever the technology is these days, but get them out of these prisons. But I think, I'm optimistic enough to think that we will get there. But whether we get the leadership from the High Court remains open to question. I think ultimately with the right case going to the High Court, we have a High Court which will produce the right answer. And I know that many judges, including, many lawyers in the profession, many of them pro bono. In fact, I'd have to say in this area, most of them pro bono, are working to get the right case to the High Court. And I think we'll get it. But I don't know when. Thanks very much.
One last short question. Did you want to ask a question? Please make it short.
I'm struck by the last part of your talk, where you alluded to some tension between the domestic law and that once humans are everywhere. Laws are always territorial. And the idea that these people or humans have rights only apply within the territorial jurisdiction. And there is a tension in the international law, given the kind of international order that we are living in. So unless we do have really a law which is not bound to the territory, such problems that you described, it seems to me will continue. And I'm also alluding to certain writings by Agamben where he says that, once you declare people as non-humans, right? Then of course, there is no question of rights. So the people in these camps and all that, these are basically... I'll ask Professor
Triggs to comment on that first proposition. Yes.
Well, look, I think the answer comes back to the point that I was making, and that is that international law doesn't have a territorial limitation. International law applies everywhere to every human being. But the core difficulty is that sovereign nations have the sovereignty power to determine how they translate that international law into domestic law. Most countries do, in one way or another. And Australia has done so to a limited degree, but not to the degree necessary to protect, for example, in relation to asylum seeker matters and arbitrary detention. So that's the dilemma. And Australia is trying to find another way, and there are other ways. One, as I say, is administrative, parliamentary, but most importantly, through education and cultural development of concepts. If culturally we believe in human rights, it doesn't really matter what the law says. The law, I'm a lawyer, but law is a limited instrument. If the public doesn't come along with that law, then the law often is unable to be effective. But if the citizens believe in the law, then you have a much greater chance of achieving outcomes. And that's why intercultural groups of this kind are so vital in ensuring that the culture of understanding human rights is there in the Australian community as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I think it should. Thank you. Ian Gray.
Well, can I also thank you, President Triggs, that was a great, interesting, stimulating speech, wrestling with the very, very hard tensions in the circumstances that we find ourselves in Australia in this area. So thank you, and thanks to Justice Bell. People must be very hungry. The food's on the table. There's more coming.